shouldn't be afraid of their government. Governments should be afraid of their people. Hello and good evening and welcome to this edition of The Vantage Point. I'm Shahin Rampati, your host this evening. Well, we had two important elections this year. A presidential election in January, a parliamentary election in August. Well, what has the government done? Where does the country stand? What does the government have to do? To ask these questions, we are joined by Dr. Dayan Jatilaka, former diplomat and political analyst. Hello, Doctor. Thank you for joining the show.
Hi, Shahin. Good evening.
Doctor, in your opinion, where does the country stand right now as we speak?
Well, I think it's fairly clear because the Honorable Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe, has delivered an important, serious and quite sophisticated lecture a few days ago, in which he spells out his plans for 2016. So I would say that we stand right now in December 2015 on the threshold of what I call the Big Bang. That is a huge political systemic change planned for 2016. The Prime Minister has set out his roadmap in the Sujata Jayawardena Memorial Oration. So we know that there will, in all probability, be a new constitution if it is approved at a referendum. And we also know, not from his oration, but from everything else that's happening and the statements of former President Kumaratunga, that there will be the special courts and special laws to try war crimes or allegations of war crimes. So these are the two tracks on which we will proceed next year. They're not usual. They are huge departures from the norm. There's to be a whole new constitutional framework, not an amendment to the constitution, but a new constitution, which the Prime Minister has set out in some detail in his important oration. And there will be new laws, new institutions, new legal institutions, and a whole new process of special courts with foreign technical expertise for war crimes trials. All of this will take place fairly early next year, according to the statements of Mr. Wickremesinghe and Madam Kumaratunga. So that's what we are looking at. We are now in transition to this huge transformation.
So does 2016 look positive for Sri Lanka?
I don't think so. I think there are far more important things to be doing than having new constitutions. I mean, well, obviously, developing the country, having a healthy economy, which we don't seem to have with the rupee plummeting. It's moving towards the 200. The dollar is moving towards the 200 rupee mark. So there's that means there's high fever in the economy. I think that attention should be spent on the economy and managing the economy rather than on a whole new constitution, which will consume a lot of time and which will lead to major political polarizations.
Do you think we need
the special courts will also lead to major political polarizations? What 2016 holds is an attempt or an experiment that has not been attempted anywhere else in the world, as far as I know, as a political scientist. And when people usually don't do something in 192 countries, there are good reasons not to. What is thought to be done in Sri Lanka 2016 is to try to do three things at the same time. To change a constitution so that the unitary character of the state is altered, that itself is huge. To have war crimes trials against an army which recently fought and won a war and ushered in peace, and shift the economy to a neoliberal, highly privatized kind of structure, which is something that no previous government did. You saw that running into trouble just a few days ago with the unions, and the Prime Minister has inched back from the precipice. So no country, a few countries try to do any two of these things at the same time, because each one causes polarization, and these polarizations tend to intersect and impact on each other and feed each other. So if a social group or political group feels aggrieved because of the economic privatization, then they're not likely to really be cooperative on constitutional change. And if another collectivity feels aggrieved by the constitutional changes, they are not likely to cooperate on war crimes trials. And if somebody feels very angry about war crimes trials, they will use these other two issues to hit back at the government that is trying to implement the war crimes tribunal. So most countries, I would say almost all countries, try not to engage in major controversial experiments at the same time. Those who have tried to do any two of these three, and that includes Prime Minister Wickremesinghe in 2001-2004, because he tried the CFA and economic liberalization at the same time. Those governments usually find themselves in a lot of political trouble. Sometimes the country itself finds itself in a lot of political turmoil, and I think that that is where we are headed next year, and I think it's all quite needless.
So what would you think will be the outcome of the establishment of a new constitution?
Well, one doesn't know whether the new constitution will be established, because as the Prime Minister has pointed out in his oration, there has to be a referendum, which means that the new constitution has to be ratified at a referendum. Now that is by no means a foregone conclusion. The government is attempting to tilt the scales in favor of a yes vote by bringing certain amendments to the penal code, which would criminalize what it calls any attempt at causing ill will or disharmony between communities. But that has already been criticized even by the head of the new Human Rights Commission, Dr. Deepika Udagama, who says that the wording is far too loose and it can be used for very dangerous purposes. So the government probably hopes to silence singular nationalist or ultra-nationalist opinion through those amendments to the penal code, and then go in for the referendum with a weakened opposition and thereby win the referendum. But that's a gamble, and usually practical leaders don't gamble too much on too many issues. Unfortunately, it looks like this government is gambling on two, maybe three important issues: war crimes tribunals, very controversial, a change from a unitary state to a quasi-federal state, that's also very controversial, and an economic changeover to a system in which the private sector and market forces will have a much bigger role than at any time since independence. For instance, the EPF and ETF being handed over to a fund manager. So these are very controversial, very tricky issues, and I really doubt that we will be seated here this time next year in December 2016 looking back at a tranquil or calm political year. I think it's going to be very turbulent, far more turbulent than our country has been in a political sense for a very long time.
But Doctor, with all that has happened so far up to date, do you not think that it is somewhat, I'm not saying completely, but somewhat necessary that we take a little bit of a gamble to sort things out, or to make a couple of changes to the system of the country?
No, why? I mean, we've had an election, and you have a new government, you have a new president. The opposition, the UNP, which was in opposition for 20 years, holds the major share of power, and I think that they should try to implement their ideas. There are many things to be done in this country, especially in terms of economic improvement, the improvement of education. The educational system is in terrible trouble. We need a far more educated young populace. There are a great many things to be done of a constructive sort. I don't think it's necessary to engage in high risk gambles, and certainly not all at the same time. Every one of these things has enormous risk, Shaheen, and we can talk about the risks involved. I wouldn't give this government much political insurance if it actually tries to move on all these three tracks at the same time. I mean, look what happened with the unions. The government had to backtrack a bit. So, if that can happen this early in the day on the economy, imagine what can happen on far more emotional issues such as war crimes tribunals and a non-unitary constitution. It's not merely like amending the constitution. It's a whole new constitution which is very controversial. I think these are high-risk endeavors, high-risk gambles, and it's not something that I've ever seen anybody be able to do simultaneously.
Let's touch on that, Dr. Jayatillaka. What are the risks?
Well, first we have to assess what the effort is, and there we have to thank the Honourable Prime Minister for his oration, in which he has rolled out his vision and his game plan. Prime Minister Vikram Singh said that there are three aspects to the new constitution which is to be ushered in early next year. He gives timelines as well, by the way. He says that public submissions on the new constitution will be entertained only until March 31st. So that's a tight time frame. And after that, the government will go for a referendum. So we are really talking about the first half of next year. Now, I'll get into what the Prime Minister said, but I want to set alongside that what former President Chandrika Bandanayake Kumaratunga said in her capacity as the head of the newly created Office of National Reconciliation. She had a press conference, and it was reported worldwide by AFP, and she said that special courts to try allegations of war crimes, she used the term major atrocities, will be set up in January, and that these will focus on what she calls the main line of command. So in other words, the top brass and the political leadership of a victorious war. And that's going to be in early January. So these are the two main tracks. There's the economic track as well, but these are the two main political tracks that we know about, where dates have been given and two important people have spoken about it. Now, Prime Minister Vikram Singh explained the changes that he hopes to make next year in the constitution. He said there will be three focus areas. Those are his terms. One, the abolition of the executive presidency. Two, the granting of more powers to the provinces, and then he spells that out, in accordance with what he calls the Austrian model of devolution. Three, electoral reform. Now, let's take the last one first because we can get it out of the way quickly. He admits that there are many problems about electoral reform because no party wants to commit electoral suicide. So there's a lot of wrestling over what kind of electoral system we should have, but I don't think we need to spend much time discussing it because, as the Prime Minister says, the political parties are committed to fighting this out in Parliament because each of them has a real vested interest in what the electoral system is going to be. And he says that, well, they have been examining various hybrids, but this debate is still going on. So we can leave that, we can set that aside. Now, the two main ideas that he has expressed, one is the abolition of the executive presidency, and the other is greater devolution of powers in accordance with the Austrian model. That is the that's the roadmap, that's the game plan, that's the framework, and that's where I think the problem is.
Austrian model?
Yes. Now, the Austrian model, Shaheen, it's very simple. Google search will do the job. The Austrian model, when you open the first page of the Austrian Constitution, right on top, the Austrian Constitution is a federal constitution. It defines itself as a federation. It also has an executive president, but Prime Minister Vikram Singh's idea is to drop the executive presidency. So we are not really talking about the Austrian model as a totality. The Prime Minister himself says that he is looking, or the government is looking at the Austrian model, and he recommends the Austrian model in relation to the devolution of power to the provinces. So what we are talking about is a federal constitution, which of course is the opposite of a unitary constitution. And he says that he thinks that powers which are granted to the provincial legislature, the provincial council, i.e. the province, should not be capable of being revoked, being taken back by the national parliament. Now, Shaheen, that is the major difference between the devolution of power within a unitary framework, such as in Britain or Sri Lanka or China or the Philippines, and a federal system. You have unitary systems without devolution. Sri Lanka up until 87, until the 13th Amendment. Or France, it's a unitary state, there is no devolution of power. I mean, you have local authorities, but there are no, you don't have provincial assemblies of the sort that you have in Germany, for instance, which is a federal system. Then you have unitary states with devolution of power. Now, what is devolution? Devolution means that the parliament, in which sovereignty is vested, because the people as a whole have sovereignty, and this is vested in parliament. The parliament transfers some power downwards and outwards. So, from the capital, the power is transferred, some power over some subjects is transferred to the periphery, to the provinces. But the parliament, because it represents the country as a whole, is on top, and these assemblies are at another level. So some power concerning some subjects is transferred downwards, it's shared downward. But under exceptional circumstances, those powers can be pulled back by the national parliament. That is devolution within a unitary state.
So do you believe that this is needed or not?
Well, it's needed because, I mean, I was working with President Premadas in 1990 when the Northeastern Provincial Council threatened to declare independence unilaterally, and President Premadas had to go to Parliament and pull the power back and dissolve that assembly. So, since we don't know how an assembly will conduct itself, for instance, what if there was some injustice to one of the minorities in the Eastern Province, for instance, the single minority, then the National Assembly, the Parliament, has to have the power to take those powers back. But if you give power to an assembly and you can't take it back, that's not the devolution of power, that is federalism. Because in a federal system, it's not a vertical relationship, it's a horizontal relationship between the units and the center. In a unitary state, it's a vertical relationship where the center, representing the whole, shares some power downward and outward and can take it back. So there's a safety mechanism. Now, Prime Minister Vikram Singh says that he does not believe that the powers that are granted to the provinces should be revocable by and to the national parliament. He also says that the provincial legislature should have the power to pass laws even on subjects that the national parliament passes laws on. Now, in the existing 13th Amendment, you have some powers which are reserved for the government, some powers transferred to the provincial council, and some powers are shared. Now, that's fine, so long as you have the capacity, then the Parliament has the capacity to pull back those powers in case they are misused. But if you have a situation in which the Provincial Assembly can make laws on subjects that the National Assembly also makes laws, and the National Assembly goes in one way because it is looking at a national policy, and the Provincial Assembly goes in a completely contrary way because it's looking at a provincial dynamic, then you have a deadlock. And if you do not have the capacity to revoke that power, to pull it back to the National Assembly, then the province and the nation will go in two different ways. And Prime Minister Wickremesinghe says that he doesn't think that the power of the province should be revoked or could be revoked by the National Assembly, and he thinks that the Provincial Assembly should be able to legislate on some of the same subjects that the National Assembly legislates on. He goes beyond this and he says that executive power should also be shared between the National Cabinet that sits here and the Provincial Cabinet. Now, executive power under our existing system is vested in the presidency because the presidency is elected by the free vote of the people of the island as a whole. Therefore, the presidency represents the totality of the country. I mean, not everybody votes for president, but you need a majority of all the people. Therefore, executive power is vested there. And the president appoints the governor of the province, and executive power therefore is exercised through the governor. It's from the president through his agent or proxy, the governor. But if you abolish the executive presidency, then you have a structure without a top, without a stabilizing apex. And you have provinces which share executive power with the national cabinet. And provincial legislatures which can legislate on subjects that even the parliament legislates.
This is a good thing.
No, it's a bad thing because you have a multipolar situation. It's a multipolar situation in which you have a northern-east which is only 19 miles away from Tamil Nadu with 80 million co-ethnics, and a very hostile Tamil Nadu, I might say, because Chief Minister Jayalalitha actually gave a letter to Prime Minister Modi calling for support for Tamil. I mean, this was not a public speech where she was trying to get votes. It was a letter she gave in August this year. So you have a sensitive border province, a vulnerable province, which would be given powers which cannot be taken back by the National Assembly. You would not have an strong executive president being able to keep this entire system together. So you have powerful centers, and even in the rest of the country, you will have provincial consciousness surfacing, breaking through any kind of broader consciousness. So it's a very, very serious matter. Usually, federal systems have a presidency. I mean, the United States has an elected president. Russia has an elected president. You usually need that kind of stabilizing apex. China is a unitary state with devolution. There are autonomous regions. China has a president. Now you knock off the presidency and you give more powers to the provinces which the national parliament cannot pull back. Then you share executive power with the provinces. Now that's a very radical experiment which would weaken the state.
So is this why electoral reforms are important?
Electoral reforms have very little to do with this. It really wouldn't matter whether you have a first past the post system or a PR system, because this is to do with the relationship between, this is to do with the character of the constitution. Electoral reforms are not to do with the character of the state. This is to do with whether the state is federal, or whether it is unitary, whether there is devolution, or whether you have a federal type of autonomy, whether you have an executive president holding the balance between these strong provinces or not. So this is a very, very big change. It is almost, it's actually bigger than a war in that sense. Because if there's in a war, matters are much simpler. You either the north east were broken off or not. But what is planned here is really what I call a big bang, because it will blow up two constitutional models that we have had before. The 72 Constitution of Madam Bandanayake and Felix Bandanayake, Dr. Colvin de Silva, was the first Republican Constitution. And that enshrined the unitary state. That was 1972. In 1978, you have the UNP Constitution, or rather the Constitution argued for and promulgated by President Jayawardena, which gave us a strong executive presidency and the system of proportional representation. Now, what Prime Minister Vikram Singh hopes to do is to detonate an explosion under both these constitutional models, because it will no longer be a unitary state, which it was in 72 and in 78, because President Jayawardena didn't change that. And we will not have an executive presidency. So the two constitutional frameworks that we had since the early 70s will be blown up. And furthermore, you would even have a new constitution which rejects the arrangement made by the Solberry Commission, because when the representatives of Tamil nationalism were for a federal system, the Solberry Constitution said no, that they are going to, basically they had a unitary system, though it was not called unitary. And D.S. Nayaka managed to outmaneuver the sectional demands or the parochial demands of Tamil nationalism at that time. So what you would have here, if you look at this new constitution that Prime Minister Vikram Singh has spelled out in the Sujata Jayawardena Memorial Oration, as a political scientist, I would say that this is closest to the aspirations and the project of Mr. S.J.B. Chelvanayagam, who founded the Federal Party. Because when you take as a model the Austrian constitution, which is a federal model, then you're closest to the thinking of Mr. Chelvanayagam, and you have rejected the executive presidential model of Jayawardena, you have rejected the unitary state model of Sirimao Bandanayake. And that's a huge change. It's almost difficult to envisage a different change in the state framework of Sri Lanka. Now, together with that, when you are going to move on setting up new legislation, a new prosecutor's office, which is different from the Attorney General's office, and new courts, special courts, in order to try your army and those who gave political leadership to what was a successful war, and a popular war, because it ended terrorism, which ended only 6 years ago, then that itself is a hugely emotional issue. You try to do these two things at the same time, you're really trying to do something that no country, as far as I know, has ever done. And I wish the Prime Minister and the former President Kumaratunga luck, because if they manage to do something that nobody has done anywhere in the world, then they deserve to get into the Guinness Book of Records.
Thank you, Dr. Jayatillaka. We'll cross over for a short commercial break. More on the other side. Hello, welcome to Vantage Point here on Newsfirst MTV. We're in discussion with Dr. Dayan Jayatillaka on the state's current affairs. Dr. Jayatillaka, let's talk about the budget. Rather controversial budget, don't you think?
Well, yes, I mean, it triggered the threat of a token general strike. I think we're all lucky that that was called off, because the Prime Minister seemed to take a step or half a step back in Parliament. That shows a willingness to be flexible. But I also noticed that the bank employees' agitation went ahead. So he wasn't entirely successful in calling off all the strikes and all the agitations. The bank sector is very important in any country, and the bank employees mobilized in a very impressive manifestation, as it were. So I think, yes, it has been a controversial budget. It's controversial for two reasons. Because it envisaged an economic model. It's rather like the Constitution and the special courts. It's the economic equivalent. It's an economic model which Sri Lanka has not tried before. It's not the same as the UNP's models under Senanayaka, Jayawardena or Premadasa. It attempts things that none of them ever did, for very good reason, because they were too controversial. For instance, the clubbing of the EPF and ETF and putting it under fund manager and then investing the fund. Now, the previous government did invest some monies, but that was only the interest.
But the Prime Minister did say that the EPF and the ETF would be maintained as separate entities, wouldn't he?
Well, we have to see how this plays out, because the budget, which is a formal document and a process, talked about the EPF and ETF being brought together under a fund manager, under fund management. Now, we don't know whether that will be changed. We have to see it in as formal a document as the budget was. If it's purely verbal, one doesn't know what exactly is going to happen.
The Prime Minister also said that these matters are open for discussion with the Finance Minister, and that they are being reconsidered by the Cabinet as well.
That is the good thing. But what we know on the record is that these two funds were to be brought under an overarching body which would invest them. Now that's very risky. Then there are several other measures which the banks, state and private, saw as a threat to their very existence. So these matters will have to be resolved. I think the problem is that the budget was too radical a departure from economic common sense. Economic common sense prescribes that you really don't talk in terms of leasing your plantations for 50 years to foreign companies, because even a competitor can lease your tea estates, somebody who competes with you in the tea market. Now that is not prudent, but this budget has many experimental ideas in it, and these are bound to create problems as we go on. Who expected a clash with the trade unions, including trade unions that supported this government? I mean, who expected it so soon? That is possible only because of the controversial nature of the budget. Why did it have to be a controversial budget? I don't see why. There's another problem with the budget which underlies this whole thing. I think we discussed this the last time. Australia leased the port of Darwin to China for 99 years. Britain made an enormous attempt to roll out the red carpet for President Xi Jinping of China and managed to get him to sign an enormous $63 billion investment deal for Britain. Now, Britain and Australia are looking to China for economic support and assistance and investment. But Sri Lanka, which had a special relationship with China, turned away from China, and now it's trying to turn back with the port city project and so on. But it gave the wrong signals to the Chinese as well. And look to the West. The government is still talking about an IMF loan next year. Now, if you turn to the IMF, you have to be willing to implement certain changes. Now, those changes are of a sort that would get the unions onto the streets. Something I really think is positive, but came as a bit of a surprise, was the common press conference held by people who really can't stand each other. That's the JVP's trade union boss Lanka and Chamira Koswata, who is the leader of the frontline Socialist Party's trade unions. That is the party that was formed after breaking away from the JVP. I mean, people who break away from each other really hate each other, and they're the last people who get together. But Lanka and Chamira Koswata and their fellow trade union bosses got together for a joint press conference. Now that tells me that if these guys who broke away from each other, who can't stand each other, are getting together at the trade union level, then there is an apprehension on the part of the trade unions that something bad is going to happen and that they need to unite because big battles are coming up next year. So I think that this budget has been too far out in right field, as the Americans would say, too experimental, too way out in terms of ideas, and it turned away from China at the wrong time when Australia and Britain are turning to China because that's where the money is, and therefore it is turned towards the IMF, is looking towards Washington, and therefore it is trying to transform the economy in a way that will upset the trade unions.
Dr. Jayatillaka, there are certain allegations from members of the government, that since the government is moving towards a positive move or so on and so forth, that these trade union actions, protests and opposition towards the budget is being incited by the former regime. What do you make of this?
Well, most of the trade union leaders who are involved in this are people who supported the government on January 8th. I don't see anybody in there. There's one name that has been mentioned, a GMOA leader. But then how can one guy bring the whole GMOA out? The GMOA has always been very independent. And I can't imagine that one personality can maneuver the whole of the GMOA. These are doctors. The bank employees are very independent. These are qualified. Both the doctors and the bank employees are kind of an elite. These are educated people, far more educated than the rest of the workforce. You don't get to be a bank employee unless you pass so many exams. And of course we know about the medical profession. So to say that Mahinda Rajapaksa somehow has the capacity to get bank employees of state and private banks to agitate, and to get the GMOA to agitate, I think that's flattering Mahinda Rajapaksa far too generously. I don't think he has the capacity. The SLFP has never been a party with a very strong trade union base, especially when it's out of power. Alawi Maulana back in the day was a strong trade union boss of the SLFP, but the SLFP is a peasant-based party. It's farmers and the provinces. It's not urban, unionized workers. That's the UNP, that's the left, the JVP, FSP, Independence, and the UNP. So I don't see how Mahinda Rajapaksa or that segment of the opposition can do this.
But Doctor, there seems
why would the GMO listen to what an ousted president has to say?
Also, Dr. Jayatillaka, the so-called joint opposition, they claim to have a rather set of people rallied around them to oppose the budget.
Yeah.
But in fact, when the budget was in fact passed in Parliament, or when it was taken up for debate, the prominent members of the joint oppositions, namely Minister MP Vimal Weerawangsa, Udaya Manpila, in fact even former President Mahinda Rajapaksa, Mahinda Rajapaksa in fact was not in the chambers to vote against the budget, and neither did Vimal Weerawangsa and Udaya Manpila raise their voices against the budget. Why do you think this is happening?
Well, I think the most important thing about the joint opposition and the budget is that they showed that they had the numbers. There are about 50, I think 52 voted against.
52. And
of those, you can discount the JVP, which means that the joint opposition has about 50 guys, maybe 48 or something like that. That's pretty big, because there was a lot of speculation that there would be crossovers. And that didn't happen.
Crossovers as in government opposition? To the government.
To the government, using the budget, that the government would manage to draw some people from the joint opposition.
So this in turn gives the government 2/3 majority, doesn't it?
Yeah, but the joint opposition remains formidable in numerical terms because it held the line, it showed that it had the votes, and it really demonstrated its strength in numerical terms. It showed that it exists and that it could not be intimidated by threat of disciplinary action into voting with the government. As for Mahinda Rajapaksa, I don't know why he didn't, why he absented himself, but I can guess, because if he had voted against the government, the SLFP, the official SLFP, may have taken disciplinary action against him, and I don't think he wanted to fall into that trap. But he did speak on probably the most important issue, that is the vote of the Ministry of Defence. and that's a subject he cares a lot about. He made a very hard-hitting speech in Parliament on the Defence Ministry Board. And his son, Nama Rajapaksa, made an equally hard-hitting speech on the Ministry of External Affairs Board. So, I think the Rajapaksas have shown where they stand. They're very much with the joint opposition. But they weren't, certainly Mahinda Rajapaksa wasn't foolish enough to put his neck on the chopper so that disciplinary action could be taken against him in voting against the budget. I mean, I have a feeling the guy will probably absent himself on the 19th as well. Why should he fall into a trap?
Dr. Jadil, let's stray away from the budget for a moment. JVP MP Bimal Ratnayaka made a very interesting statement in Parliament a couple of days ago. Rather a plea from whoever that not to incite racism in the country. What do you make of his speech he made in Parliament?
Well, Bimal, I mean, it's good that speeches be made against the incitement of racism. But the example he gave is not really an example of the incitement of racism. He says that there were photographs of Mahavira celebrations in Tamil Nadu, which were posted on social media,
yes,
as have been taken place in the north and east. Now, yes, I think that happened, and that is an inaccuracy, that's an exaggeration. But in the first place, those were not imaginary photographs. Those Mahavira celebrations did take place in Tamil Nadu, and in fact, Mr. Vaiko made a speech. Now, Mahavira celebrations also took place in the north and east, and the Sri Lankan media didn't report it. I checked it out in the Tamil Guardian, and I saw the photographs. There were reports in the Sri Lankan press of a Mahavira celebration that took place, presided over by Mr. Mave Senadiraja, the head of the Ilangai Tamil Arusukatchi. I mean, this is not some fringe radical. This is a TNA MP, an important TNA MP, who heads the Ilangai Tamil Arusukatchi, and it took place in the TNA office. Now, Mahavira Day is not a day where all Tamils who were killed, including by the Tigers, are celebrated. No, are commemorated. Mahavira Day was instituted by Velupilla Prabhakaran. It was commemorated by the Tigers, and it commemorates those who died in the Tiger cause. And it was commemorated by the TNA in the TNA office by Mave Senadiraja. It was commemorated at the University of Jaffna. The Tamil Guardian shows all the photographs in Vavuniya, Kilinochi, and everywhere in the north and east it was commemorated. If you talk about inciting racism, one of the things that was blacked out of the local media, but actually one saw it because the TV cameras caught it, is that poor boy who killed himself, Sundara, who Mr. Sambandhan spoke about him, that he committed suicide because of Tamil prisoners. But the TV cameras showed the letter he wrote, and the still camera took a photograph, and that appeared in Ceylon Today in a column. And the letter starts with block capital letters with the words "To Tamil Ila," and it ends, this suicide note ends with also in block capital letters "In Tamil Ila." So now this is not just about Tamil prisoners. This is somebody who was the latest in a long line from Sivakumaran in 1970 something, and all the suicide bombers who killed themselves for Tamil Ila. The only difference between this boy and those are that they managed to kill other people before they killed themselves. And he couldn't because the Tigers had been defeated. Now, that is also not to say that in Parliament while you're talking on the subject is also something that should not be done. So, the Mahavira celebration, do you think that in any country in the West, any Islamic group would be allowed to have Mahavira celebrations, with guys in camouflage? But in Wembley Stadium in London, they had a Mahavira celebration this year. So it's absolute hypocrisy. This is not about dead Tamil people. This is about tigers. And if somebody put a photograph from Tamil Nadu, it doesn't mean that that photograph is imaginary. It means that he was trying to exaggerate. And then that should be criticized on the social media. If you see somebody lying, you immediately correct it or you issue a statement. But my worry is that this is all a prelude to pass the amendment to the penal code that Minister Gayantha Kamaratilaka is bringing in January. There are two amendments. According to that amendment, the causing of ill will or disharmony between communities gets you locked up for a minimum of 2 years, and you don't need a warrant to arrest such persons. Now, I have to tell you about the United Nations. The UN has a UN declaration against racism and racial discrimination. It's called the Durban Declaration because the conference was held under Nelson Mandela, the UN conference in 2001 in Durban. There was a 10-year review conference like on climate change, the Durban Review Conference, and in Geneva the Human Rights Council had what is known as the Intergovernmental Working Group, that's 193 countries, reviewing the effective implementation of the UN Declaration, the Durban Declaration against racism and racial discrimination. That document was taken to New York and endorsed by the General Assembly, and if you Google the document, on top, on the front page, 2 lines down is my name. Why is my name there? Because I was the chairman. Now, in that we dealt with how to stop racism and racial discrimination and attempts to agitate violence against communities. The Islamic countries said you must criminalize blasphemy. That is, defamation of religion should be criminalized. The West, supported by the progressive Latin American countries, said no, freedom of expression means that we should be able to say anything we want. Now, I was chairing that and we got a consensus. What I proposed and what was finally carried was that we limit this to incitement of hatred and violence. Because if you say what the new legislation in Sri Lanka says, ill will, disharmony, I mean, these are so broad, you can use it to arrest anybody and keep them locked up for 2 years. Simply because, you make it a statement against the federal constitution. That can be interpreted as creating ill will or disharmony. You have to limit it, raise the bar, so that that law can be used for the purpose of stopping people from inciting hatred and violence towards another community, such as the speeches made in Alutgama. But if the penal code is amended in the manner that this government hopes to do, they'll lock up Vima Veeramansa and Uday Gammanpilla and go for the referendum and try to get the constitution, the federal constitution passed. So, Bimal Ratnayaka's speech I see as not very balanced. Because how can you, at the same time, how can a government talk about repealing sections of the Prevention of Terrorism Act? That's to prevent terrorism. Okay, there's no war on, but other countries which are not at war have Prevention of Terrorism Acts in order to prevent terrorism. So the government wants to dismantle the Prevention of Terrorism Act. It wants to release people who have been in jail for committing violent, lethal offences, but it wants to bring an amendment to the penal code which will allow anybody who allegedly causes ill will and disharmony to be locked up for 2 years, a minimum of 2 years, where he can be arrested even without a warrant. Does this make sense to you?
Okay, Doctor, very quickly, speaking of inciting racism and hate speech, let's move across all the way to the United States, where 2016 US presidential candidate Donald Trump made a rather controversial and interesting statement, a proposal rather, saying that Muslims should be banned from entering the US temporarily. What do you make of this statement?
Well, what I make of the statement is...
Well, first of all, before that, what do you think of Mr. Donald Trump?
Well, I think Mr. Donald Trump is an insult to the... is insulting the intelligence of the American people, and I think the American people are not going to vote for him. And I hope they don't.
Let's now move on to the statement he made then.
Yeah, well, first it tells me something about the Republican Party. If he wins a Republican nomination, the Republican Party is committing suicide. What it shows me is that the Republican Party hasn't learned its lesson from the defeat of 2008. In 2008, it had a decent candidate, John McCain, but it accommodated Sarah Palin, who was like too far out in right field. I mean, she was the first to start talking about this sort of thing, and the American people rejected the Republicans. And they didn't learn the lesson of shifting to the center, the moderate center. It happened again at the last election. Well, Mitt Romney wasn't as crazy as, wasn't a Sarah Palin, but the Republican Party did not demonstrate that it had learned its lesson and moved away from the fringe, the Tea Party fringe. Donald Trump is the latest incarnation of that right-wing populism in the Republican Party. Now, I know that Senator Hillary Clinton is not the best news for Sri Lanka, from where I stand. But before I'm a Sri Lankan, I'm a human being.
But neither would Donald Trump, would he?
Yeah, but there are many Sri Lankan so-called patriots, super patriots, who don't understand that. They think the Republicans are good for Sri Lankan sovereignty. They don't understand that somebody like Trump will take one look at Sri Lanka and say, hey, these guys are close to China, and and sort of just put the hammer down. But including in the joint opposition, the Rajapaksa camp, there has never been clarity about the Democrats and the Republicans. I mean, they just never understood American politics. So they think the Republicans are good for us. A Republican administration could be good for Sri Lankan sovereignty so long as it's not some crazy who's anti-Chinese and anti-every foreigner. I think the American people are never going to allow themselves. I may be very wrong, but I have lived and studied and taught in the United States. I would be very surprised. I'd be shocked if the American people allowed themselves to be represented in the world by Donald Trump. I think they will vote for Hillary Clinton. And whatever will in Sri Lanka, I hope the American people vote for Hillary Clinton, because the world does not deserve Donald Trump, and America doesn't deserve Donald Trump as the President of the United States.
Even the British Parliament is set to debate, because a petition has been signed titled Boycott Donald J. Trump for President, something along those lines, where it has received more than 400,000 signatures rather to ban him from entering the United Kingdom.
Absolutely. I mean, Shaheen, it's not just the Labour Party. I mean, there are those here who will say it's the British Labour Party. It's not just a Labour Party. One of the best known, if slightly controversial, outspoken...
Even British Prime Minister David Cameron has said no.
David Cameron, but Boris Johnson, who's usually outspoken, an outspoken conservative, the former mayor of London, he replied Donald Trump. Donald Trump said there are places in London that he wouldn't risk going to because they are so dangerous. And Boris Johnson, the Conservative Party politician, said there are places, the former mayor of London.
He is the mayor of London, I think.
Is he? I'm kind of out of touch with that. He said that there are places that he wouldn't go to in New York because of the risk of running into Donald Trump. So, I mean, Donald Trump is not even the kind of Republican that the British Conservative, their sister party, can relate to. This is too far out in I mean, it's crazy. It's just crazy.
Dr. Jatala, just a quick touch.
And crude.
Let's now cross over to the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, where 19 female politicians were elected to municipal council, which is a rather historic election in Saudi Arabia, opening the polls for women to take part. What do you make of that?
Well, it's about time, isn't it? I mean, it's a very small step for the rest of humanity by the standards of the rest of the world, but it's a giant leap for Saudi Arabia, which tells you something about Saudi Arabia. And there is this huge contradiction where the United States, which claims to stand for women's rights, Samantha Power came to Sri Lanka and said, look, you have only 5% of women in your parliament, you had 2% in 1948, that's not much of an increase. But the closest ally of the United States in the Middle East, apart from Israel, is Saudi Arabia. The closest ally in the Arab world is Saudi Arabia. But American values on democracy and equal rights for women certainly have not taken hold in Saudi Arabia. So it's a good thing that they're beginning even to inch forward on this issue, but there's a long way to go, even for them to catch up with Jordan. I mean, the rest of the Arab world is much further ahead in terms of gender-based integration than is Saudi Arabia. Look at the Iranian parliament. The Iranian parliament and the Iranian cabinet, the Iranian politics has so many educated women. And Saudi Arabia, as you know, is competing with Iran as the most authentic representatives of Islam. But Iran, which is supposed to be very conservative and so on, has a far higher degree of incorporation of women in all walks of life, including politics, than has pro-American Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jadil, for joining on the show this evening. It was a pleasure to have you. Always interesting to talk to you. Well, there you have it. Dr. Jadil says we don't need a new constitution. Until next time, I'm Shahan Rampati from Vantage Point here on Newsfirst. Good night.